Tonight we have a really fascinating and interesting panel with three really fascinating and interesting people, and we'll start off by introducing some of those. So we are joined live from New York by Jayathma Wickramanayake, who is the second UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, appointed in 2017. She works to expand the engagement, participation and advocacy efforts of youth across the four main pillars of the work of the United Nations: development, human rights, peace and security, and humanitarian action. We're also joined by Sophie Daud, who is the CEO of the Future Leaders Network and the chairperson of the 2021 Y7 Summit. She has worked in the Cabinet Office's Civil Contingencies Secretariat and was the head of the Accelerated Development Schemes at the Cabinet Office, where she was responsible for the leadership training given to the top 1,000 civil servants. She has worked across government in a number of different policy roles, including as a behavioural scientist, and studied natural sciences here at Cambridge too. And we are also joined by Tessie Ojo, CBE, who is the CEO of the Diana Award, a charity that has developed internationally recognised programmes supporting young people to create positive change. She is the first British national to be honoured with the Martin Luther King Award for her innovative approach to leadership and humanitarian work. And British Airways named Tessie one of the top 100 British leaders. She sits on numerous boards, including the BBC Appeals Advisory Committee and Comic Relief. We can start with a round of opening remarks from our speakers, and then we'll dive into some other questions. And I'm going to start by asking you, Sophie, what is leadership? What makes good leadership? And why does it matter?
Thank you so much, Tom. And can I just start off by thanking you for having me here, and also saying what an honour it is to be speaking alongside these two phenomenal leaders. So what is leadership? What does it mean to me? When you sent me that, Tom, I thought, that's a huge question. And it seems right and fitting that, you know, it came to me. So my day job at the moment is I am Chief Executive Officer at the Future Leaders Network. We are a non-profit organisation aimed at discovering and developing the next generation of social, political and economic leaders here in the United Kingdom. So we spend a lot of time thinking about leadership because it is at the core of our mission. And I think the most important way to think about this is to kind of ask, why does leadership matter? And I think about this in a very kind of personal way. As an individual, I know that I've had times when leaders have inspired and excited me, and times when they have demotivated and paralysed me. I remember, you know, many different jobs and many different roles, both in my professional and personal life, where I've either wanted to jump out of bed in the morning or I wanted to hide underneath the covers. And I do think a lot of that is to do with the leaders that you're surrounded by and how great they are, or how difficult sometimes it can be when leadership isn't working right. But I think beyond an individual level, leadership matters to teams and societies. Leaders can unite us in pursuit of a common cause, or they can sow division and discontent. And I think that's really important, because leaders don't just affect individuals, they affect the groups of people who are around us and the way that those interactions work. But finally, and most importantly, I genuinely think leadership matters to the planet. And I don't just mean that in a kind of an environmental way, although I guess all of us, I'm sure, are training our eyes towards COP26, which is taking place in Glasgow at the start of next month. You know, world leaders and leaders across, you know, business, civil society, the third sector will play a crucial role in tackling things like climate change, but also things like social injustice, poverty. Leaders genuinely do make a really big difference to those big things which sound like these broad concepts, but I also think they have implications for societies and individuals. So when you ask me kind of, what do I think leadership is? What does it mean to me? The reality is I've spent the vast majority of the last year kind of studying that. And I look at lots of the literature, and a lot of it tends to define leadership in terms of what it's not. So leadership is not management, or it is different to management, or leadership in distinction to followership. And I think those are useful frameworks to have, but we personally have chosen to go with thinking about what leadership is instead of what it isn't. We've chosen a really broad definition of leadership at the Future Leaders Network, and we argue that leadership is the ability to unite a group of people to achieve progress in pursuit of a common cause. It's mega broad, right? It's mega broad, and we chose it that way for a reason. What we wanted to be able to do was to encapsulate that a leader could be the person who chairs their sports team, they could be someone who runs a community group, they could be someone in a business setting, in a political setting, or just a leader in a group of friends. We wanted to choose something that really resonated with leaders across the piece. Because from our perspective, leadership does not belong to one discipline alone. So if you look out there at lots of the literature, lots of it is about kind of business leaders, and that's because quite a lot of money is in business, and you know, business has a vested interest in trying to investigate what makes a good business leader. But I think we'd be wrong to assume that leaders only exist in a business space. And actually what we want to show is that leaders are multidisciplinary, and they come from all backgrounds, and they live and breathe in all walks of life. The other thing that our definition of leadership really encapsulates is that leadership is not positional. You can have leader in your name, but not lead. And that is really important to us, that actually leaders can come from anywhere. They can be the most junior person in the team, they can be the most senior person in a team, but actually leadership can come from everyone, regardless of where you are in the kind of hierarchy or decision-making chain. So that's a bit of kind of our articulation of what we think leadership is. Just a bit of like, what does that constitute? How do you deliver that? Actually, under our definition, we have three core kind of elements of leadership. The first is purpose. You know, back to my definition, they are uniting a group of people to achieve progress in pursuit of a common goal. That means great leaders know the power of why. And that breaks down into two things. The first is leaders have a vision. They know where they want to get to, and they have motivation. They have a really good articulation of why we should get there. And often they will appeal to intrinsic motivation, the stuff that we find personally rewarding, not just the stuff that sounds good and brings money and status and fame. I genuinely think great leaders understand the power of why. The second thing that makes a great leader, and I'm going to use this in kind of inverted commas, power. And by that, I mean influence. I genuinely think great leaders influence. They change opinion, they change behavior, they change discourse. Leaders do something that wouldn't have happened without them there. I genuinely think if you say that you are the leader of a social movement that would have happened with whether or not you had been at the head of it or not, I think you are a figurehead and you are not a leader. And then finally, leaders are all about people. Leaders themselves are people. They are individuals, they are humans, just like everyone else, but they also lead people. And this relates really strongly to the idea of legacy. If you just deliver, you know, progress in pursuit of something that matters really meaningfully to you, you change people's opinions, but when you die, the idea dies with you, I don't believe you are a leader. I genuinely think leaders think about legacy, they think about the people that they inspire and that will come after them. They think about succession planning, and they think about how they create inclusive teams. So to kind of wrap up that point, I think leadership really matters for a whole bunch of reasons to us as people, to teams, and to the planet. I think leadership is really about delivering, uniting a group of people in pursuit of progress against a common goal. And I think it comes down to three core elements: purpose, power, and people. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. But in my 5-minute intro, I kind of wanted to share with you a little bit of my thoughts about what leadership is and why it's so important.
Wow, thank you, Sophie. What a start. That was super interesting. Purpose, power, people. I think we'll return to some of those later on. Tessie, let's go to you. I want to ask you an equally big question. How powerful is activism?
A very big question. I had the same thought like Sophie when I read it, and I thought, well, you want me to answer this in 5 minutes? But I'm just going to pick up on something that Sophie said. You know, growing up, I was always told that you needed to be a leader without a title. And what it meant is when you see stuff that needs doing, just do it. You don't need to have a title. you know, if the floor is messy, just clean it. You don't need to wait for the person who's designated to clean it to do it. And to me, that is leadership, but also so there's something about that that says, I'm just an active citizen. I'm a citizen that's aware of my surroundings. I'm a citizen that notices the people around me, and I'm a citizen that would go where there's pain. But if I was going to, and so for me, that's a very generic kind of my disposition, or my very basic definition of activism. You know, for me, like I said, activism for me is about creating a more equitable world. Like I said, growing up, I was always told about leadership without title. And so for me, from a very young age, I realized how deeply unequal our world was. And sometimes, even as a child, it might be giving my pocket money to someone because I realized they had no lunch, or writing petition, even from the minute I knew how to write, it might be a petition to the head teacher, petition to anyone who would listen to me just because I saw something that was wrong. The biggest kind of break for me around really defining what activism meant was when I was 13. I had a best friend. I still have a best friend. But I realized for the first time that her brother had an illness that I had never heard about. He had sickle cell anemia. I witnessed him for the first time going through a crisis. And I remember sitting there thinking, why is he, what's this? Tell me more. And she went on to tell me, and it ended with this dialogue that said, actually, there's no cure. He's got to live with this for the rest of his life. And at 13, there was a righteous anger in me that said, I'm going to do something about it. And I think for me, my 13-year-old self, just want to caveat that I never actually did anything about it. My plan was to study medicine, and I didn't. I studied biochemistry, but we can come to that later. But I think for me, activism must be underpinned by empathy. There's something you cannot actively, the thing that moves you to want to, something must move you to want to care. Otherwise, why are you doing it? Is it performative? Are you doing it for a title? Are you doing it for recognition? For me, activism has to be, without doubt, grounded, underpinned by empathy, and grounded in social change, in wanting a more equitable world, in wanting equality for something or some people, or dignity. It has to center around people, lives, or places. You know, activism for me also is about spotlighting issues that are hidden or perhaps ignored by those with power. And so it's about a movement of people saying, actually, we've observed X, like I've noticed that actually no one's investing in sickle cell anemia, and we want to bring that to the light. We want to spotlight it. There's always a danger that whilst intentions might be right, that activities associated with social change movements could itself become problematic for the very same public that you're trying to serve. And that's why I strongly believe that you simply cannot separate empathy or compassion from activism. It's not about you. It's got to be much bigger than you. And you've got to center the people. Who are you serving? Who are you trying to bring about change for? Or what are you trying to bring about change for? It has to be, you have to, and I often talk about leadership with compassion. It's the same thing. Activism with compassion and empathy has to work hand in hand. I'm not sure if people know about Bill Moyer's action plan, but he often highlights the four different roles of activism and basically any social movements. That in order to completely create social change, you have these 4 different roles that you play. First, starting off with being the citizen. Then at some point in your life, or in the life circle of of the social movement, you are a rebel. At a different point, you're a change agent. And at another point, you're a reformer. Now, these are all incredibly important but different roles that in being an activist, you must be careful to understand what am I trying to do? Who am I educating? What am I doing? What is the change I'm trying to achieve, and how am I bringing people? I think you said it very clearly earlier, Sophie, about leadership has to be about people. Same about activism. It's got to be about the people you're trying to create change for. Whilst I might not have time to touch on these 4 different roles, I want to talk about the citizen. Because, there's a saying that says you cannot be who you're not. So firstly, even as an activist, you have to be a good citizen. You have to both be, but also be seen by the public as a responsible citizen. You need to win the respect and ultimately the acceptance from people that you're trying to lead. You actively must include how you live your life. And by this, I mean, your life must reflect the very same fundamental principles, the values, the symbols of what a good citizen means, because it is only when you actively live a life of a good citizen that when you see something wrong and you say to people, stop, something's wrong, it's authentic, it's not performative. For example, if I don't vote and I spend all of my life complaining about politics, then actually I'm not an activist. I'm just a noisemaker. Because if I really want to be a good citizen, I should vote. And for me, it's so important that time and time again, we've seen how people get caught out when people say one thing and actually they do something different. My very big warning is you will be caught out, you will be found out. So before you want to become an activist, before you think about, I'm going to be a rebel, firstly, you need to be a good citizen. Because when you are a good citizen, you will notice when something is wrong. And at that point, when you become a rebel for a minute, because being a rebel means you will stand up and say, no, you are protesting against something, against social conditions or institutional policies and practices that violate the very core of societal values. And that gives you authenticity, because you're saying, actually, no, I want to be respected. I'm respectful of others. And so when I feel like my rights are being, or the rights of a group of people are being disrespected, I have the legitimacy to say, no, I don't want that. Whilst I said I don't have the time to go through all of the 4 phases, I think also the one thing I want to pick out from those 4 phases is also being very aware about your role in educating, in bringing people along, in involving the public, your role in working with authorities, with people who can, if not you're just, on one hand, you can never remain a complete rebel. That's not activism. Activism is really making sure you're going through the full circle. I have the privilege in my job as the Diana Award to work with incredible young people who are passionate about social change. Interestingly, our strap line at the Diana Award is that young people have the power to change their world. And that is something that fundamentally is cut to everything. We 100% believe that young people should be at the table. They are critical in shaping the future that they're going to live. And therefore, it's important that young people have a voice, that young people are empowered to have a voice. I would love to end this session by just sharing a couple of examples of young people who are incredible activists. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Fingers crossed. I'm going to, before I share this, I'm going to quickly share this young lady who is called Shomi. Shomi, and this is just an example of a young person who kicked off her journey that really started from the point of empathy. Shomi is from Bangladesh, and she, a few years ago, about 5-6 years ago, she lost her mom. She lost her mom to something as simple as diarrhea, and coming from a fairly affluent family, didn't really realize how that one could die from this. And when it happened to her, she suddenly came to a place of thinking, we live in a clean environment, we have all of this privilege around us, and yet this tragic loss has happened to my family. What about those who live in the slums? I wonder how many thousands die as a result of poor sanitation. And she completely sets up a program that's completely focused on people who live in the slums, people who live in neighborhoods that are not very safe, really teaching them about sanitation. I chose to share about Shomi because she probably, before this incident, would never have thought about sanitation and the importance of hygiene because it never occurred to her. But something happens in her life and it draws her close to a cause, and then she runs this whole, and she's a huge activist, a massive campaigner who completely understands that you have to immerse yourself. It has to be centered around the people. The other story I'm just gonna play this video. It's about 3 minutes, but I'm only gonna play like a minute and a half. And I'm going to tell you why. This is a young lady called Muna who campaigns for around FGM. She has been campaigning about FGM for years and years. And I wish I had time to share with you. I will send you the link. I wish to share the whole full circle of her, of this video, because it brings to life these 4 different phases that I'm talking about. But hopefully, I'm going to play a minute and a half. Let's listen in.
When we started the work, we were only 4 girls, teenagers, and the initial work was around female genital mutilation. And it was a subject that was really difficult to speak about. And we remember our head teacher had a phone call one day where someone had said there are 72 men who are coming to the school and who will protest outside the school because he's let a group of 14-year-old girls talk about FGM. And he had a massive panic. So the 72 men never turned up. It was just a threat. But what happened then was, we had men consistently follow us home just to show us that, we're there and we will intimidate you until you stop. But all that just gave us, I think, that extra fire that we needed, because if we can experience this, maybe that 12 and 13-year-old girl will not. I think that's why we carry on, and that's why we do the work we do.
She's inspired all of us young people in Integrate, going to a school where FGM wasn't talked about, and because she was talking about it, everyone wanted to know more. The fact that she was so fearless and was going on Newsnight saying, "Dave, grow a pair."
Going on Newsnight was one of our kind of first time experiencing a massive media outlet that was really interested in the voices of young people when it came to FGM. And I remember being asked by the journalist who was doing the interview,
"Do you have a message for David Cameron?"
To grow a pair and do something about FGM. And if you can't handle the issue, then there's no point of you doing your job. So I was grounded for 2 weeks because I'd insulted the Prime Minister of this country.
I love that part of the video because this is a young girl who's 14 and just passionate about change and leads the people. You can see it's centered always around the people. And she had this one moment when she became a rebel by telling the whole entire Prime Minister to grow a pair. And of course, she got grounded for 2 weeks. But that's that whole, I wish, that's why I said, if I could show you the rest of the video, but you see the whole, how it's all about the people, it's all about bringing others along, and it's about educating and changing. And thanks to the work that she's done, of course, we now know there's changes to policy. So the sum of it is activism is great, but we need to be careful that we're not self-serving, that it's about the people, for the people. And we're so mindful not to stay on one side of activism, but we go through that whole full circle.
Amazing. Thank you, Tessie. It'd be great if you could send the link to those clips afterwards, and we'll make sure to send them round. I think the words that stand out for me from what you've just said are citizen and compassion and empathy, and I'm sure their themes will pick up on later on too. We'll go to Jayathma, but I'll come back to you quickly after, so I know you need to leave a little bit early, Tessie, and I think I'll ask you about the distinction that or the lack of distinction that you picked up on a little bit between leadership and activism. But first, I'd love to ask you, Jayathma, what role do you think young people can play and are playing to help us create a fairer, more just and more equal world?
Thank you very much, Tom, for the question and for the invitation to be here. I think Tessie has really given the answer to that question with the examples that she showed us in the previous video, but also in her work. So I'll try to be very brief in maybe trying to link what Tessie was showing us and showcasing on the examples of youth leadership versus the principles or the ideals of leadership that Sophie earlier spoke about. I think we have to, when we talk about young people, start the conversation from the place, why are we talking about young people right now in terms of driving activism, in terms of leading change in their communities, and to also put it very clear that people are not doing this because they have a lot of time to spare or a lot of resources to spare. Most of the time these are issues of survival, and many of them do this on top of so many challenges that they're facing just because they are born in this period of time where our world is going through a massive amount of multidimensional, multisectoral challenges. So as we know today, we have the world the largest generation of people in the history. So we have about half of the world's population at the age of 30, and about 90% of them living in developing countries. So I usually like to say that being a young person today is being into millennials, Gen Z, young people today are most educated generation ever on our planet. They're also the most interconnected generation of young people because of technology connectivity. But on the other hand, young people are disproportionately affected by these multifaceted crises affecting every aspect of their lives, from education to livelihoods for their future, including the COVID-19 crisis, the climate crisis, growing inequalities, conflicts around the world, and many more. For an example, if you take COVID-19 alone, 1 in 8 young people lost access to education during the pandemic, and most of them are girls. 1 in 6 young people lost their jobs, most of them who were in the informal sector in developing or least developed countries. Access to mental health, access to sexual and reproductive health got challenged during the pandemic, resulting in an increase in unwanted pregnancies around the world, and additional 10 million girls at the risk of child marriages. So the most affected young people, I would say, in this situation that we are in right now are young people, but mostly those who already belong to groups that have been traditionally systemically marginalized, like young women and girls, LGBTIQ+ young people, indigenous young people with disabilities, young refugees, young migrants, and many more groups who face additional intersectional challenges because of their identities. But they're also the groups of young people who are the most resilient. And they are also the groups of young people who are the most vocal and most active when the conditions are conducive them to carry out their activism. So for an example, last year, the UN, when it turned 75 years, we did an exercise of listening to the world's young people. While we recognized that the trust between young people and institutions like the UN, like their governments, was deteriorating, we also found that young people are also the group of the demographic in the world right now that are most optimistic about their future. They said, we look forward to a more just, more fair, more equitable future, given that institutions listen to us today, given that political leaders listen to us today, given that we reform our institutions to be more inclusive, to be more transparent, to be more diverse, so that we can collectively achieve the future that we all want. So right now, from the side of the UN, including through establishment of my job and my office, we are trying increasingly to engage young people in shaping the policies, shaping the strategies, shaping the resolutions at the intergovernmental level, to make sure that we are future-proof, to make sure that we listen to the needs and the rights and the priorities of young people who make up half of the world's population right now, but those decisions that will affect their present, but most importantly, their futures. So for me, really, it's about highlighting those leadership aspects that young people have shown in communities, in running their own businesses, startups, activism, social movements, and bringing that innovation, bringing that energy, bringing creativity, and bringing that boldness and authenticity into institutions, and reforming ourselves in a way that we are representative of the society that we are working for and we are working with. So let me stop here and pass the floor back to you, Tom, but very happy to also listen to some of the questions coming from the audience.
Amazing. Thank you, Jayathma. I think the things that stuck out for me there was young people are disproportionately affected, and especially those which are already marginalized. But we're also one of the most resilient and active groups. I think that dynamic is really interesting. Tessie, before you leave, can I ask you, do you think leadership and activism are two different things, or do you think they're much of the same? How would you draw the distinction between the two, if you would just draw a distinction?
I mean, to be honest, I think I'm just going to go back to what I started with, that leaders do not need a title to lead. And that's, to me, activism, as if done right, it's about leadership. It's about, you know, I often talk about, and I kind of just digress a little bit, I often talk about, I call myself a campaigner, and the whole point, the whole essence of my campaigning journey is about showing people a vision of the world that I would love to see. I want to see a world where everyone is equal, everyone have access they need. Leadership is about, and activism is about constantly showing people that picture, but also telling them how. So it's not about standing in the corner and constantly pointing what's not happening. It's bringing people along, understanding that, look, I might not eventually, as much as I want to, like I promised my 13-year-old friend that I would be the person who discovers the cure for sickle cell anemia. Whilst I didn't achieve that, the other day on the news, a couple of weeks ago, actually, I heard on the news about a new drug for the first time that's been tested, or that had just been approved for use. And I talk about it every time. So I know I'm not responsible for that. I would love to claim responsibility, but I'm not. But my job, since I was 13 till date, is to talk about it, to raise awareness. If you guys haven't heard about sickle cell anemia, you've heard it today. So understanding that you play a role, you might not be the beginning and the ending of that, but you're playing, and I think it comes back to what Sophie was saying earlier about legacy. Leaders who should be good activists, and should be legacy minded, should be purpose minded. Where are you going? Why are you doing this? And what is the journey? Who's going to take it on after you're gone? You know, who else? There's also, and there's a African proverb that says it takes an entire village to raise a child. If you ever seen anyone who says, I'm going to do it all by myself, then they're not a leader. So for me, a good leader is also a good activist, because it's about bringing people along. But ultimately, they're mission focused, they're purpose minded, and it's about the people.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to finish this section on. Thank you, Tessie, for joining us. Have safe travels.
Thank you. I'm sorry I can't stay till the end, but I hope it goes well.
No problem. Thank you, Tessie. Sophie, I want to ask you a question now. So I think you've got a really interesting leadership journey, and it'd be great to dive into that a little bit more. So could you tell us a little bit more about the challenges that you have faced as you have developed as a leader?
Sure, and I think I'm gonna try and tell you two stories if I can, Tom, in response to that. The first, I guess, is like a very personal story, like a really personal story about me becoming a leader. And I genuinely thought leadership was about the roles that I was given and the titles that I was inheriting. And I remember, as you kind of very kindly alluded to in my kind of introduction, so I was a civil servant. I worked in the UK government for just over 8 years. And I was really lucky. I was promoted very quickly. I was kind of touted as a young BAME woman of huge potential, and I was put into these quite incredible positions, and I felt totally unprepared. Totally unprepared. I remember sitting there and going, I cannot be the first person to have had to lead a team where someone isn't pulling their weight, or where we're facing criticism, or we're not achieving our milestones, or I don't believe that we have the right values. I cannot be the first person to do this. And yet I feel like I'm discovering all of these issues by myself. And that was really powerful for me, because if I'm honest, it really upset me. I felt very insecure, especially as a very young leader in the civil service. And my response to that was, go find out. Someone else will have done this before. Go find those people, go learn from them, go do something about it. And actually, that's how I got involved in the Future Leaders Network. I sought out an opportunity that I thought would help me with my leadership skills. And, the reality was I was selected to represent the UK at the Youth 7 Summit back in 2016. And that really was like a life-changing moment for me, because I led a team of 3 men, all of whom were older than me, but I learned how to create an inclusive team culture. I learned how to influence others. I learned how to speak on an international scale. And I learned how to trust myself. That was a massive challenge for me. As I say, I felt like the big challenge for me was like, I'm unprepared for this. But the way I've responded to that challenge isn't just to kind of change stuff for me. It's actually to change stuff for everyone. That is why I'm the chief exec of the Future Leaders Network. I genuinely believe leadership is a set of skills, behaviors, and judgments that you improve through practice. But the way that we do leadership development now is broken. We do not offer people leadership training until after they have become leaders, not before. And I liken this to like the equivalent of elite sportsmanship. The way we train kind of, Premier League footballers is we select them from a really young age. We train them. We give them the opportunity to practice different plays, to see different environments, to practice over and over again, doing a goal from this angle or that angle, or countering this defense. The way we currently do leadership now is the equivalent of throwing people onto a Premier League football pitch and saying, if in 10 games time you've scored a goal, we might give you some coaching. Like, the reality is we only give it to the people that we think are good leaders after they have become leaders. And that is really, really worrying for me. So the challenge that I'm talking about there is not just one that I've encountered personally, but that professionally I've set my life up to solve. That's kind of one story about the challenge I've encountered as a leader, but the other is really that, like, I really like rules, and I really like, I'm the type of person who, for those of you who are joining us from the United Kingdom, I stand on the right and walk on the left on the elevators. I wait until the green light shows at the crossing lights. I love rules. And there's this amazing quote, which is, well-behaved women seldom make history. Its provenance is debatable. I'm not going to go into that. But effectively what they were saying is, like, rule-abiding women go nowhere. And I kind of found that like a bit painful, is the honest answer. Someone who loved rules and who felt like I was doing the right thing by kind of following rules. I was really shocked by that. And I think it links back to something that actually Tessie just mentioned about, like, you can't change the world until you've been a citizen of the world. Sometimes you've got to follow the rules because they are the right thing to do. But it means that every time you break a rule, it becomes really clear that you are doing so intentionally. You're not doing so because you you just couldn't be bothered. You're doing it because you think the right thing to do is not to follow that rule. And that rule breaking, that disobedience, can be really small, but have a huge effect. And if I can give you kind of a story to illustrate that, I talked about my time in the civil service, where I saw many female leaders kind of dialing into meetings on their non-working days. So maybe they had a 4-day working week to look after their children, and they dialed in on a Friday from their kids' football match to join a meeting. And I found that really unhelpful. What I didn't do, I didn't feel like I was in a position to call them out. But when I eventually moved to a 4-day working week, I took no phone calls on that Friday. That was not my day. And I think that kind of small rule breaking has such a big impact, because to give you an example of something more recent, I've just chaired the Youth 7, the official youth engagement group for the G7. The youth engagement group is the newest engagement group. It has no money. It has been viewed continuously by world leaders as the little sister, as the mock G7, as the people who are kind of cute. And I wanted to change that, but I had no money. I had no big backers. All I had was me and my fantastic team of volunteers who really cared about it. We didn't revolutionize the world through this massive big bang. We revolutionized the world through every small change that we made. We argued every single time with decision makers that young people should have more chances to be in a room with them, that we should do more things to make it more inclusive for young people, that we should involve more young people in those spaces. And even though each of those small arguments, they felt tiny, ultimately, they paved the way for this year's Youth G7 to be the most inclusive in history. It had over 50,000 young people contributing to it in any one way, despite having pretty much no money, but also the most impactful in history. We secured time with the UK Prime Minister, and as a result, we got mental health in the G7 Leaders Declaration as a direct result of our work. So I think the kind of second challenge I want to come back to is sometimes it feels a bit scary. Sometimes it feels like leaders have to be these kind of revolutionary figures who are like heroes, and they are just like mythical. It doesn't have to be huge. You can be a leader through small steps of disobedience when you're breaking those rules is really intentional, and those small things all add up to actually being something really quite impressive that can deliver real world change. So don't be shy, guys. Break the rules one step at a time when you think they're the right rules to be broken.
Break the rules one step at a time when you think they're the right rules to be broken. I think that's really, really interesting and useful takeaway. Jayathma, I want to ask you a similar sort of personal question. You are one of the youngest senior leaders at the United Nations, if not the youngest. You have a big, complicated portfolio. That is an incredible responsibility to have. Well, what is it like to be a young leader among what I assume is probably not many young leaders at the top end of the United Nations? What is it like? What is it like for you?
Very stressful, to give a very short answer. But I think there are different aspects of that. One, I identify myself a lot with what Sophie said in terms of, being put in a leadership position with also not having that sort of backing or the support or the empowerment that you need. For me, it was very intimidating as well, because I remember going into my very first cabinet meeting and just looking around, like the president of Chile, the former president of Chile, the former president of former prime minister of Portugal. All my peers in the cabinet are former retired head of state or ministers of foreign affairs, who are a few decades older than me, and some were actually even older than my parents. So it was very intimidating at the beginning, but I found a lot of support in the other women leaders who were around the table. For an example, the Deputy Secretary General, Dr. Natalia Kanem. These are a few of the other senior women leaders and women leaders of color who are in the cabinet. And I remember in my very first meeting, when I was even shocked to even speak, they would turn to me and ask, Jayathma, do you have anything to add? And that made me really ease into that environment and feel like I'm a part of this team, and that I actually have the same level of power and authority and voice as anybody else here. So for me, this was one of the first interactions, and then of course having that support system of and mentorship of these senior women leaders who treated me like an equal was very, very empowering. I think secondly, there are a lot of stereotypes about, being young and being a woman and being a woman of color. There have been many instances where I've been stopped from entering into meetings because people wanted to double check if I'm actually who I am claiming to be. People walking into rooms and asking me, so where's the envoy? Not thinking that I'm actually the envoy. A lot of the time in the UN, people think it's sort of probably a white man in a suit, much more older, when they think of a special envoy. So a lot of these stereotypes, and at first I actually started thinking that maybe there's something wrong with me, maybe that I don't carry myself like an envoy, and this is why they think this way. And then slowly, when you experience that, and when you do a lot of self-reflection, you figure out, actually it's not wrong with me, it's something wrong with them, because they're programmed to think in a different way. And actually my presence here helps break that programming and helps break those stereotypes. So that it is important that I be very resilient, and I respond to those instances in a very calm and collective manner without being emotional, because this is I see as a precedence that I also set for the women who are coming after me. I think third challenge was, as Sophie said, many of the youth organizations, youth platforms, youth programs around the world are underfunded or not funded at all. So for an example, I do not receive any funding from the UN's main budget to do my work. So I have to fundraise 100% for my team, for myself, and for the programs that we do. So I remember starting off and just being really shocked that this program is there, it's highly visible, massive amount of responsibility, but absolutely no funding. And kind of, now you're supposed to come up with your own plan and funding plan, and then also implement that and show results so that, your own office and platform can survive. So, but now I think we've proven that when you have, even though when there's limited resources, when you have the right team and when you have the right tools, and when you actually invest in changing the culture and transforming some of the systems from within, that change can happen. And the report of the Secretary General that was recently launched about the future of the UN actually recognizes the work that has been happening on the youth file through my office and my predecessor, and recommends that the UN actually considers putting it in a sustainable footing by integrating it into the UN's general, the main formal architecture. So of course, little wins, but I think the process of starting and getting here has not been easy. So I just want everybody who is listening us to also know that unfortunately our society and our mindsets are still not programmed in a way to see young people, younger women of color, especially as leaders, because their stereotypical understanding of a leader, as Sophie said, is somebody completely different. So as those who are breaking this concrete ceiling, it's not even a glass ceiling, I feel it's concrete, we are the ones who are breaking it for the first time. So we have to be extremely resilient, extremely persistent, and the perseverance is also very important, so that when we break it, they cannot build it back, and that people who are following us can follow through. So yeah, I know it was a long answer, but I hope I was at least able to bring in a few perspectives from my experience.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Jayathma. I think it's amazing how both of you have been able to achieve so much without the kind of financial backing that I think people would typically assume with the sorts of roles that both of you have. When you put leadership at the center of things and build the team around you, things start to fall into place. I want to open up to some audience questions now. So if you have a question and you're on the Zoom call, then feel free to stick your hand up or turn your camera on. And we'll take a question. And if you're watching the live stream, feel free to stick something in the chat. If we don't have any questions right now, a few were sent in beforehand that I'll turn to. we've got a question from Zita. Great, let's go for this. So I'll go first to you, Sophie, and then to Jayathma. Do you have any advice for young women of colour wanting to get into activism? What are the first few steps, for example?
Sure, I'm happy to kind of answer this. And I think I'd answer this in a way that I hope resonates with lots of people, actually. Is start small. When we see something that we want to change in the world and we feel really passionately about it, it's really easy to go too big too fast. To go, oh my God, we have to tackle racial inequality, and that means I have to go huge. And that can be really quite demotivating for you as an individual. And I say that because it's actually really hard to change those really huge things, at least, especially from a standing start. My suggestion would be choose something small, choose something local, choose something that you genuinely care about. You remember I talked about purpose being so important here. Choose something that genuinely fires you up inside and gets you really angry or really excited about. And choose something small and tangible that you can focus on in a kind of a short-term project. And the reason for that is not only will it persuade other people to join you when you can show progress or kind of clear wins, I suppose. It incentivizes funders, it incentivizes other people to join you, but it also incentivizes you, because often, you know, at the start of your activism career, and I definitely remember this as a young woman of color, I remember thinking, like, I can't do this. There is no one else who looks like me doing this. I cannot change the world. It won't happen. But I remember when I did one small thing and I did it, I was like, yeah, I can do the next one now. And then I can do the next one. And then I can do the next one. And then I hope ultimately I'll still get to the big thing that I originally set out towards, the original thing that got me fired up in my belly the first time around. But I started from a space of choose something small, choose something meaningful, choose something purposeful that I care about. Take action on it. You will personally get confidence and you will build confidence around you. And I do think that's the way that you change the world one step at a time.
Awesome. Thank you. Jayathma, what do you think?
Yes, I'll try to be the devil's advocate here and maybe answer from a different perspective. And Zita, I really want you to also take this very constructively. I don't think you can get into activism. It's not a sector or a club that you can get into, I feel. Either you are an activist or not. And I think the misconception that we have in the world today is in order to become active or speak up about an issue or to do something about an issue that you have to be an activist. And I think that is wrong. For an example, I do not consider myself an activist. I consider myself an advocate. I advocate for the rights of young people and for those rights to be realized in economic, social, political arenas. And similarly, I think all of us have a different role in society. All of us have to play different roles in this ecosystem in order to bring about change. For an example, not everyone has to take a megaphone and go into the streets and protest about an issue. You can be an artist who uses music to educate people. You can be a teacher who holds extra classes for students to learn about climate change or human rights. You can be an author who writes a book about an issue. You can be a mother, you can be a father, you can be a parent who talks to their children from very early on about issues of social justice. So I think we shouldn't pressure ourselves to also become activists because I think it also diminishes the different roles that each one of us are unique to play in this society to bring about change. So my advice really would be to identify what is it that you're passionate about, not only like as a cause, but also what skill sets do you have as a professional, as an individual to contribute to that cause. And that might not be activism, that could be a different way of doing it. And that's completely okay. As Sophie said, we change the world one step at a time, and every small step and every single step counts.
Thank you very much, guys.
Great, thank you for the questions, Isa. We've got 4 minutes left, so I'm going to ask another question, which is, too big to answer in the time, but we're going to ask it anyway and see how it goes before we close off. How do you go about striking the balance between staying true to who you are and what you believe in, and then compromising who you are and what you believe in to get things done? Jayathma, I'll start with you, so I think you need to head off 6:30 on the dot, just in case we head over a couple of minutes.
Yes, I mean, I think it's one of the biggest dilemmas also for me in doing this job, right? Because you have an ideal thing that you would want to do, but then it's either the system or the partners you work with might be going in a different direction. So you have this option of boycotting or canceling the people you work with, or trying to debate with them, argue with them, and arrive at a compromise solution. And this is something that I often think about. And I think I also use different strategies at different times. You will also see, if you, for an example, follow me on social media, I issue statements criticizing sometimes government and organizations about the work that they do, when it reaches a point that, you know, we cannot tolerate this type of behavior or sort of, you know, violation of people's rights anymore. So we use these tactics of not compromising and really setting the standards very high and strong when it comes to issues such as human rights and that affects people's dignity and livelihoods. But then in certain cases, when it's about, say, a certain strategy or certain policy or a certain program that we want to get passed in a certain country, maybe we will negotiate with the government how much of it will they take now and how much of it will they take in the future, how that ties in with the funding that they will receive either from the UN or with an external partner, and then you have to go into a compromise solution. I think it's really a judgment call that you have to make depending on how much progress you can make with a specific partner. You know, for an example, in a country where there's not even, say, democracy per se, or like a parliament or elections, I wouldn't be going in and talking about the right of young people to vote or participate in elections, because it doesn't exist there. And I know that I cannot start from that point. There I would be talking about sort of getting young people more interested in civic life and civic education, and working on political education and democracy in the educational curriculums, and using a step-by-step approach to do that. But for an example, if there are countries that have a very strong and healthy democracy, but has a restriction that says unless you're 35 years old you can't run for elections, then I would be going to that partner with a little bit more stronger stance, and we'll be really trying not to compromise and remove those legal restrictions from young people for running for political office. So for me, it's really about being very sort of also politically savvy and making those judgment calls about when we compromise and when we don't compromise. And unfortunately, I think in this work, there are instances where you have to compromise, but there are also instances that you can really not compromise and still move forward with a different strategy.
Great. Okay, thank you. Sophie,
just to maybe say sorry because I have to leave. Thank you so much for inviting me. And Sophie, it was great seeing you again as well. You're fantastic as always. Please let's keep in touch, and I look forward to also supporting all of you in your future endeavors. Thank you.
Thanks, Jayathma.
Thank you for joining us, Jayathma. Great. Over to you, Sophie.
So look, I'll keep my response here quite short, Tom, because I think Jayathma gave a brilliant example there. I think it comes down to like exactly what you're compromising on. And I think from my perspective, it's always been really important for me not to compromise the why, but it's okay to compromise the how and the what sometimes. And by that, I mean, you know, you might have a really clear indication of like the end goal, the vision of the world that you want to see, and why you think it's important to get there. And I think anyone who's trying to ask you to compromise on that is asking you to change your core values and what makes you an authentic leader. And I think I'd be pretty resistant to compromising on any of those things. But there are, and there always will be, differences of opinion on how you achieve that end goal and what you do deliver it. And on those, I think engaging in an honest dialogue and understanding why the other person thinks that that is a better option, and the kind of the challenges that might be involved in taking your preferred option, I think those are the negotiables, and those are what any great leader or any great activist is constantly in a kind of sense-making, information-seeking, intuiting process, trying to gather evidence about. But for me, you know, I think there is a, you know, if someone is asking me to compromise on my why, I'm pretty firm that that won't happen. And like, I'll give you a really good example to kind of close us off. I asked the Prime Minister to open the Y7 summit. And I said, I would like you to join a 10-minute Zoom call or kind of online platform call. And I got told by his office, you get a 30-second Twitter clip. And my why was, this was the Prime Minister acknowledging the hugely important work that young people had done for this year's G7. And I responded, you know, and that 30-second Twitter clip, you know, he gives that to, you know, like a good cup of tea or something like that, right? I didn't feel like the what that his office were offering me achieved the why of why I was inviting him. And so I responded to number 10, with all due respect, I don't want your 30-second Twitter clip. Do you know what we got? I got a half-hour interview with the Prime Minister. And I think that comes down to, I believe really strongly in your why, and if you believe in it too, you will be able to persuade others. But of course, sometimes you have to negotiate on the what, and you have to negotiate on the how. And that, as a leader, you will be learning all the time. There's no hard and fast rule. It's impossible for me to give you advice on that. So to wrap up, don't ever compromise on your why, guys. You deserve it.
Amazing. Thank you, Sophie. Last one standing. It's been a real privilege to have you here and to be a small part of this conversation too. Lots to take away, and Sean, I think from that we'll upload everything to the YouTube afterwards if anyone wants to visit back some of that and send the videos around that Tessie was sharing as well. Thank you again, Sophie, and to Tessie and Jayathma, not here now, but for joining us as well, and to everyone who has tuned in to watch. Have a great evening and a great rest of the week.
Thank you for having us, Tom. Thank you.